I've been involved in space law, space policy for about 10 years or so, and you learn who's who in this field. And I know that Steve's one of the big names in it. I've read a lot of stuff he's done. He was at a class that I was just a student at about 10 years ago, and he's a person that is definitely qualified to talk on this topic, even though I couldn't think of it earlier in the talk here. So, he has 15 years government experience. He's been at Aerojet for 10 years. He's the immediate past president of the Association of USA Members of the International Institute of Space Law. That's probably the most prestigious international space law group around. He does have a JD degree, but I ask that you not hold that against him today. He's not here as a lawyer. He does have an exciting vision for world space cooperation. And with that, I'd like to welcome Stephen Doyle.
Well, we have an audience. I bet we wouldn't. I bet when they called the break, everybody would leave, and they said that's not a technical topic, so I'll go away and go listen to the engineers. But what we're going to talk about now for the next 30 or 40 minutes, very non-technical, but very much a part of letting the technology happen. We're going to be talking about some past practices that have created the structures that exist today for international cooperation in astronautics. I particularly want to talk about how the rules of the game have been put in place and how those rules are going to be evolving and changing in the near future. I'd like to talk a little bit about the dominance of the early space powers, the Soviet Union, the United States, and the position they have evolved into, and then talk about some of the recent dramatic shifts that have occurred, the available choices today for access to space based on some of these dramatic changes. I'd like to talk about some new patterns of international behavior that are likely to appear in the very near future. And I've cut the future into 3 segments, in part because it's an easy way to address them, but it also makes a reasonable construction of view graphs to guide the talk. So we'll talk about the near term from now to 1995. We'll talk about the midterm, what I call the midterm from 96 to the year 2000, and then the long term, which I look at as post-2000. A lot of things have changed, and I think if you read the paper or pay any attention to what's going on in the world around you, you're aware of the enormous geopolitical changes that we've all experienced in the last 2 years. And there are very few pundits who will stand up before an audience today and tell you what they think is going to happen next, because I don't think anyone a year ago could have predicted many of the events that occurred in the past year. But before we go to predicting the future, which is always a difficult thing to do with any credibility, I want to talk about how we got the legal structure that exists today primarily through the United Nations activity. After Sputnik was launched in 1957, the United Nations created an ad hoc committee in 1958, which ultimately became a permanent standing committee of the General Assembly, and it meets annually and has a scientific and technical subcommittee and a legal subcommittee. Its basic work is done at the subcommittee level and negotiated there. The S&T meets in March or April. The legal subcommittee usually meets in April or May, and the parent committee meets in June. The parent committee prepares an annual resolution that goes to the General Assembly. It's called the Space Omnibus Resolution, and it covers all of the activities that have gone on in the past year and all of the recommendations that the committee has for the General Assembly to consider for work for the next year. So the committee writes its own agenda. It's the only committee in the United Nations where there is no voting. Very few people realize that, but the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space has a consensus rule. And whenever anything is before that committee and being negotiated, before it can go out of the committee and be delivered to the General Assembly, there has to be consensus, which does not mean that everyone has to agree, but it does mean no one disagrees. And very often nations will sit there and hold their tongue because they are isolated, or they feel that it would be counterproductive to enter an objection to something that's going forward. Using that non-voting procedure, the United Nations established a number of treaties in the 1960s and 1970s. The Treaty on Principles concerning the activities of states and the peaceful use of outer space. In 1967, they adopted a registration convention for the establishment of national registries for space objects and an international registry to be maintained by the Secretary General of the United Nations. There is an international liability convention for liability for injured third parties created through space operations, adopted in 1972. There is a return on there is an agreement on the rescue and return of astronauts and return of space objects. And most recently, in 1979, there was a treaty agreed relating to activity on the moon. This last treaty has not been widely subscribed to. It has fewer than 10 ratified signatures. And it appears to be a dead letter because it purports to establish a legal regime, or at least take steps toward the establishment of a legal regime to manage the resources on the moon the way the seabed treaty purports to manage access to and use of resources on the seabed. And the developed countries of the world have declined to become bound by that kind of a regime that says, if you're going to exploit it, you have to exploit it on behalf of everybody. You have to make your technology available to everybody. Everybody gets a share of what you derive. And we've chosen not to sign such a treaty at this time. There are a number of organizational charters out there. You may have heard of the International Telecommunications Satellite Organization. 120 states operating the global communications satellite network. There is an International Maritime Satellite Organization. There is a Soviet-sponsored international communication system known as Intersputnik. These are global organizations participated in by nations around the world for satellite communication operations. There are regional systems, the earliest of which were the European Launch and Development Organization, E Doyle, and the European Space Research Organization, both of which arose in the 1960s. They were the precursors to the European Space Agency, which was formally established in 1975. We have an Arab satellite consortium of 22 Arab language states. We have a variety of organizations growing up around the world for collaboration and cooperation on a regional basis. In Europe now, there is a European Meteorological Satellite Organization that operates METSATs for Western Europe. There is a European Telecommunications Satellite Organization, Eutelsat, that operates telecommunication services for Western Europe. We have a variety of bilateral agreements that have come up over time. Some of the more famous were the Franco-German Symphony project of the early 1970s, which involved the creation of a 3-axis gravity gradient stabilized satellite that was launched by NASA after a long harangue and was operated for about 5 years for developmental experimentation with communication satellite technology built by the French and the Germans. There was the very famous US-USSR bilateral program, the Apollo-Soyuz project, 1975. We each launched manned vehicles. They rendezvoused in space. Crews exchanged through the cabins. And at that point, that was the end of what had been hoped to be a spur to increase cooperation between the US and the USSR. Bilateral agreements have existed in the form of treaties. The United States entered into a treaty with Japan in the early 1970s under which technology was transferred there for the development of the Japanese N launch vehicle, which is the equivalent of about a 1969 Delta-class vehicle. And then there is an increasing volume of national legislation that's coming online. We have a lot of it in the United States. National Aeronautics and Space Act of 1958, the Communication Satellite Act of 1962, the International Maritime Communication Act, 1978. There's now a Commercial Launch Vehicle Act, 1984. Commercial Remote Sensing Satellite Act, 1984. There are national laws now in Canada, in the United Kingdom, in Germany, in Japan, in India, and there are national space research organizations well established and funded in conducting short-term, long-term programs. Over the time that all of this was going on, from 1960 to 1980, the USSR and the United States were in dominant roles. The evolution of the space law that I've described was essentially paced by Soviet and US activity. If one of us didn't agree on what was going at the UN, it didn't go. It sat there for another year. And until the US and the Soviet Union and Western European nations agreed, nothing went forward out of the Outer Space Committee. Access to space was essentially controlled for any substantial payloads by the United States and the Soviet Union up until the time of the emergence of the Ariane launch vehicle, and then it became a three-way competition, and ultimately the Chinese came into the field. So we have a breakdown in the duopoly that was controlled for about 20 years by the Soviet Union and the United States. If you wanted to put something in space, you had to come to one of them and make an arrangement for either an international cooperative program in which there was no exchange of funds, or you had to pay on a typical basis to have the launch provided for you. After the initial introduction of satellite operational systems in the early 1960s, for the decade of the 60s and for most of the 70s, all of the communication satellites that were put up in the world were built either in the United States or in the Soviet Union. Until Symphony came along as an experimental satellite in the early 70s, there weren't any communication satellites built outside the United States. There had been several systems built in the United States by Hughes particularly, and sold to Canada, sold to Indonesia, and to other countries. But the United States and the Soviet Union controlled the evolution of the technology and the management of the technology for satellite communications well into the 1970s. Same two organizations, the same two nations led the establishment of international organizations. Intelsat, the International Telecommunications Satellite Organization I mentioned, exists today because the United States took the lead in the early 1960s, pulled together an international conference, the first session of which was hosted in the United States to establish the treaty to create Intelsat. Intersputnik exists today because the Soviet Union in 1970 decided to pull together all of the communist government states and get them to coordinate on a global satellite system. They led the early global organizational activities in many ways. They also established international exchange of meteorological satellite data through the World Meteorological Organization. We established a World Weather Watch Control Center in Maryland, and there was a counterpart organization established in Moscow. The United States and the Soviet Union also were in position to control the technology. They were able to manage the technology so that they could sell what they had, they could make people, they could allow people to use it, they could receive revenue for it, but they managed to restrict its propagation internationally. And through controlling this technology, they sought, as I'll show you in the next view graph, a variety of objectives. Finally, these two countries for 25 years paced international exploration of space because they had the launch vehicle capability and the satellite manufacturing capability to do deep space missions. And all of the missions out to the planets and beyond were launched either by the United States or the Soviet Union and funded in those two countries. Now we have the Japanese, within the last year, have put the first satellite in orbit around the moon, Japan. We also have the Europeans sponsoring deep space missions and cometary exploration missions. So the pace of international exploration can expand because there are now more nations capable of doing it. Whether or not it will probably be determined by the amount of resources governments choose to put in that area. One can observe that for the 2 decades of the 1960s and 1970s, that with the strong position that the United States and the Soviet Union had, and trying to keep it, they managed to lose it. And this is one of the things that has markedly changed in the last 5 years. The United States and the Soviet Union had very strong technology protective practices in place, including in the United States a lot of law that required licensing of any form of technology that had anything to do with astronauts. If it was technology that related to a satellite or a launch vehicle or any ground support technology for them, you had to have technology export license cleared by the Office of Missions Control in the Department of State. Industry has chafed at those laws for years and years and years because it held back industry's capacity in this country to compete abroad. The idea was we were going to protect our security by keeping the technology home. We also felt, and there were policy decisions and policy memorandums written up in the White House that supported that approach because it also protected our capacity to compete. It kept others out of the marketplace as effective competitors. We also felt containing the technology, we could contain the spread of threats in the launch vehicle technology and the capability to deliver warheads of any kind over long distances were better not to be in many nations' hands. So our goal was to contain the technology. We've been marginally successful in that because today there are 16 nations in the third world who have one or another form of missile launch capability. Some for relatively short distance, 300 to 500 miles from the point of origin, but some of them several thousand miles. By the year 2000, it was projected by DoD that there'll be more than 20 countries out there with missile launch capability with the capacity to throw a payload more than 1,000 miles downrange. And that gives impetus to the whole talk that you heard from General Brain at lunch. It's the threat of the multiplication of that launch capability in many nations' hands that we have to really think about defending ourselves against. We're no longer trying to maintain international military stability through mutual assured destruction with the Soviets. What we're trying to talk about now is the wacko, crazy man who decides he's going to launch a payload to blow up something just to show people he can do it. And it has become painfully obvious in recent years that there are such wackos running governments in the world. So we've tried to maintain the technology, exploit our position of leadership in various ways. As someone who worked in the government for more than 15 years, I often felt and argued that we were working against our own purposes. My argument was that if we were more forthcoming in cooperative programs, we would have built a dependence of foreign institutions on our capability. We would have had them buying their guidance systems from us. We would have had them buying advanced propulsion systems from us. As it was, we refused to license them for export. We wouldn't work with anyone. We couldn't even get a joint venture cleared through the government, with the result that we forced them to go out and do it themselves. We forced Ariane into existence because we refused to allow the Europeans to jointly own the capabilities represented by Delta and Atlas. We literally forced the Japanese to go build the H vehicle family because we have refused to give them direct access to the technology that they wanted to share. We would have had a substantive role. We would have been in every one of those programs and known when the launches were being conducted. We would have been contributing parts of the launch vehicles if we had a more forthcoming cooperative attitude. I think that by trying to keep the control that we had of the technology in the dominant position over the last 20 years, ultimately what we did in the long run was we lost that control, and now there is a much more diverse world out there, and we are meeting them in head-to-head competition in the international marketplace. I think we have ignored the realities of the fact that all creativity is not in the United States too long. I think we have ignored the fact that there are other nations with resources that they can apply to astronautics, and there are governments out there who are determined to have a significant role in the conduct of astronautical activities. I think we've got to completely revise the way we have approached international cooperation in space for the last 30 years and look at a whole new method of working with foreign governments. I think a very signal example of what has happened is after we had these 25 years of domination in the access to space, we find that today there is competition among companies within the United States, and the government now goes out and buys commercial launch services to put up government-owned payloads in many cases. Commonwealth of Independent States has been trying for more than 3 years to market launch capability. And how that will be done now, or whether it will be done through the government of Russia, or through the government of Ukraine, or through the CIS, is not clear. We've been doing a lot of talking to the Soviets about how they intend to approach the launch vehicle marketplace under their restructured governmental approach, and they don't even know. So they're sorting out at home how they're going to market their launch capability, but they still have agents out in the field making bids, offering to launch vehicles, launch spacecraft at anywhere from 1/3 to 2/3 of comparable vehicle costs and prices in the West. That is, they're bidding at 2/3 of Ariane's cost, 2/3 of Delta cost, 2/3 of the Atlas cost for comparable class payloads. Chinese are doing the same thing. Chinese are bidding from 1/2 to 2/3 of the same prices. And we have had bilateral meetings with these governments. We told them if there's going to be a competition, it has to be a reasonable competition. You have to at least go out and recover the cost of what it's costing you to build your launch vehicles. And the Russians have said, well, it doesn't cost us as much as it cost you, because we do it a whole lot more sensibly. And if you were here for Ed Keith's presentation this morning, you saw how, with the number of engines they build a year and the modularity of their assembly, they could make an argument that their launch vehicles cost a whole lot less to build than ours do. They build a whole lot more of them, and they build them in a robust commercial way that we don't. But they're not building Swiss watches. They're building Chevrolets. We're over here building Swiss watches, and we insist on putting all our Swiss watches on Cadillacs. We don't have to have a Cadillac every time we want to launch something. So I think we now know that we have head-to-head competition of a very material kind coming out of the former Soviet Union, coming out of China, coming out of Western Europe. And we know that Australia is talking about establishing an international launch facility using Russian launch capability out of Australia. Brazil is talking about starting a new launch facility in Brazil by the end of this decade. India has an independent and autonomous launch capability. They have built their own launch vehicles and launched their own satellites. Japan has that same capability, and there may well be others before the end of this decade who will emerge as potential competitors in some area of the wide range of launch vehicles that can be made available. There are a lot of lessons we can learn by looking back at history at how we've done things, but my object today is not so much to preach about what we've done wrong in the past as to think seriously about what we have to do in the future. And for that reason, I want to prognosticate a little bit. In the near term, talking about where we are and where we're likely to be going, I just want to point out in the international competitive arena, we're going to see a lot of ESA in cooperation with other governments. And there's a very fundamental reason for that. ESA is itself a 12-nation organization. The European Space Agency is made up of 12 nations. They have to cooperate just to be there. They know something about cooperation, accommodation, reciprocal give and take in negotiation. And we're going to see ESA gradually building up international competitive strength in a variety of cooperative programs centered on Western Europe. I don't think we've seen the tip of the iceberg that ESA offers in the way of a focal point for international cooperation. I do know that delegations from NASDA, the Japanese National Space Agency, and the delegations from the Soviet Union have spent a lot of time in Paris in the last 2 years talking with ESA about major bilateral or cooperative programs between ESA and those governments. And the only real cooperative program we have going right now with those governments is centered on the space station. And one has to ask, given the financial situation that prevails and the management situation at NASA, how real is it that we're going to see that space station fly in this decade? So those areas where we have sought international cooperation and committed to mutual activity, we are constantly running back and running into the problems in Congress of funding the programs. The Russians are having a lot of difficulty going around the world selling their launch vehicle capability. They think the problem is price, and they keep coming in and bidding at a lower price. At the last round of international competition at Inmarsat, for the Inmarsat 3 generation satellites, the Global Maritime Satellite Organization invited international tender of bids. And the launch we're talking about is an Atlas H Centaur class payload, something that approaches 4,000 pounds, maybe 4,100 pounds. And the Russians went in and bid that launch at $25 million. We're talking about an Atlas H Centaur, which is $110 million off the pad. So the Russians are bidding $25 million to conduct a launch that we want $110 million. The fact is they haven't chosen the Russians, and the Russians don't understand why, because the Russians are driven by the perception that it's price that wins. And there's a lot more than price that goes into the reservation that nations have about delivering payloads into the Soviet Union to be launched, particularly in today's Soviet Union. There's a fundamental insecurity about giving them anything to do for you because of the chaos that prevails within the country. The Russians are having trouble selling their services other than Earth imagery. They seem to have opened up into the market with their radar sat and started selling Earth imagery, and there's very high demand for it. And one of the major buyers of Soviet satellite imagery, U.S. government agencies outside of DoD, who are buying it because they can't get comparable data except from classified sources in DoD, and they can't declassify it and use it for applications in the open. So the Russians have established a regional office in Maryland, and they have a guy living and working in Maryland who just takes orders for imagery from U.S. government agencies for Soviet radar satellite imagery. Chinese, I think we're not paying enough attention to the Chinese. The Chinese are gradually establishing themselves as international joint enterprise co-sponsors in third world countries. They are moving into the building of companies to do provision of services, bus services, trucking services, mining services, large industry tooling services, a lot of engineering services, and the Chinese are really developing rapport in Latin America and in Africa by sending in whole teams of young men to learn the language, study at the schools, and become an integral part of the social structure that exists in those countries. We still haven't, in my view, we still haven't in the United States learned how to market what we can do. We're not effectively marketing who and what we are because we want them to come to us. We wait for the phone to ring. We're the world's worst marketeers, and we're in a highly competitive marketplace that's going to get more competitive with time. So we've got to change the way we're looking at the world and what we expect of them if we want them to expect anything of us. I'm going to go out on a limb and tell you the small sats are going to fizzle in the next 5 years, and the reason for that is you can't have that many satellites in low Earth orbit. Their orbital lifetimes are not going to be as long as projected. The frequency limitations are too great, and depending on what happens at the World Administrative Radio Conference on Space Communications that's going on right now in Malaga, Torremolinos in Spain, there may not even be enough frequencies to have all the people who want to put satellites up in low Earth orbit to provide telephone, mobile telephone, and broadcasting services. There are a lot of big decisions being made in the next 3 weeks in Malaga, Spain, that you can't even read about in the press unless you look in Space News or look at the back page of Aviation Week. You wouldn't even know this conference is going on. The International Telecommunication Union is running a conference right now that has more than 112 governments registered. And in that conference, they are allocating the frequencies to be used for space services for the next 20 years. And how that conference allocates to the mobile satellite arena is going to determine how many iridiums there can be. So we've got a lot to learn yet about small satellites. They look very attractive. We think about them as small, cheap, easy to throw up. But when you start multiplying the numbers and putting radio receivers and transmitters on every one of them and start looking at their orbital lifetime and look at the realistic cost of launches, I hope to God we get down to the point of paying $200 a pound in Rio. I hope we can get to $500. I hope we can get to $1,200 per pound in Rio. It'll make a big difference. We're now well over $2,000 a pound. And until we can get that launch cost down, systems like Iridium are not economically competitive. They have been economically validated on assumptions of launch costs significantly below anything that's currently on the market. So some of those systems you've heard described today, and you'll hear more about tomorrow, I suppose, are going to have to come into being and come into being by 1996-97 if Iridium is going to be launched and economically operated. I think there's going to be a big trade at NASA. I call it NASA's big trade. And I think what NASA is going to be offered is the chance to take the shuttle, go back to Rockwell, and say we want to reconfigure the shuttle to sustain a manned mission of 5 to 7 crew members for a period of 30 to 45 days. We want to rebuild the shuttle and expand its capability for extended stay on orbit. And that will be a whole lot cheaper in the next 3 to 5 years than trying to go ahead with the space station the way it's now configured, and NASA isn't even too happy with the way they've had to deconfigure it anyway. And NASA may be forced, as a matter of economics, in the next couple of years, to step up to the necessity to postpone the space station till after the year 2000 and go after a long duration shuttle. I just see that. I don't work for Rockwell, and I'm not trying to promote Rockwell's business, but I'm just telling you the economics of the situation tell us if you want to put some men in orbit and keep them there for a while, God's sakes, the quickest, cheapest way to do that today is go put a module on Mir and put your crew up there and use the shuttle for long stay duration, for specialized missions where you want to do something in isolation. I just don't see the space station flying in this decade. And I think NASA is going to be faced with that choice in the very near future. The United States government and NASA are currently undergoing a massive regrouping. Everybody's looking at how we're regulating, what we're regulating, the way we're regulating, the cost of regulating, the complexity of management, the difficulties that we're embroiled in. And there may well be a shakeout of the whole institutional structure of the U.S. government in the next 2 or 3 years. We may see something different than NASA by 1996. It may be a different kind of agency. We may see the shuttle given over to commercial operation by a third party and taken out of NASA's hands. NASA can continue technology development, but it will not be operating the shuttle. Unless we do that, we're never going to get control on shuttle costs. Shuttle costs have been out of control for 10 years, and if we don't segregate shuttle operations from the NASA institution, we'll never get those costs under control. So if we want to behave economically responsibly, I think we're going to have to do that kind of activity. Finally, all of these changes could well happen within the next 5 years. I may be missing by saying they're going to happen by 95, maybe 96 and 97, but I don't see them coming at a very much later date. A whole lot of other things are going on. If you look at what economics are doing to us, we're standing down our missile capability. That's not being driven by treaties, it's being driven by pure economics. We're standing down a lot of the strategic planning that we've done for the last 20 years, and we're going back to a clean sheet and starting a whole new approach to our national strategic defense posture. PSYOPs are going to be written from the ground up, and we're just going to go back to a whole different way of looking at the world. I think we're probably going to do that in space as well. I think you won't hear much about it until the Space Council has wrestled this to the ground and come up with some viable alternatives. And certainly George Bush isn't going to even talk about it this year because there's a national election pending. Toward the end of the next presidential term, whoever is in the White House has to re-examine the way we're spending money on space and the institutional structures through which we're doing it. I think it's a national necessity. Let's turn to the midterm quickly. I think that the budget pushes are going to continue to slow things down. We're going to see more and more urging of international cooperation, more cooperation opportunities, more cooperation being urged, more governments seeking cooperation. Whether they seek it with us will be determined by how we respond to their overtures. I think now we'll probably see in the period 1996 to 98 a third United Nations-sponsored World Conference on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. There was one held in 1968. All the world's nations were invited to come and learn about and report on what they were doing in space. There was another one held in 1982, and I think there'll probably be another one about 1996-98. That will be a watershed because it will be that place in time where we stop and look at all that we have done up to now and all that we would like to do in the future, when we will be doing it on a globally integrated basis. These conferences are aperiodical. They're not set on any clear term, but I think the General Assembly is very likely to start talking about having another World Space Congress to bring all the nations together and talk about outer space on a general basis, particularly focused on the peaceful uses of space, and I think we'll see that in the mid-third of this decade. We've had an awfully difficult time trying to convince selected governments that the United Nations ought to begin working on the management of space debris and establishing techniques to mitigate debris. And one of the major opponents of that is the government of the United States, who feels that we don't really understand the issue well enough. We haven't characterized the debris well enough. We don't even know how much there is out there yet. And we're just now getting the radar capability and the sensing capability we need. And we'll have, by the end of 1992, all that we need to do this job. And the argument is we can begin to look at solutions for the problem, a mitigation of the propagation of debris at least, sometime around 1993-94. Don't call me, I'll call you. The majority of nations in the UN want to start work on it now. They want to write down what the problem is. They want to look at alternative means of managing debris. They want to get it on the agenda of the Outer Space Committee. The government of the United States is the only vocal opponent of that step being taken. And I think, again, we're trying to communicate that we'll do this thing the way we want to do it, and hell with the rest of it. and I just think it's a bad posture to be in. In due course, we're just going to be overruled. What will happen is they'll put a resolution before the General Assembly, and a majority vote will put it on the agenda of the Outer Space Committee, and we'll be dragged kicking and screaming into the room to participate, rather than saying what we know about the problem, what we are nationally doing to mitigate debris, and we have a variety of both defense and civil strategies in place that are being implemented, and leading nations to the solution. We're saying don't worry about it. Eventually it'll get taken care of. And nations are very worried about it. And I think we'd be far better off to be in a proactive leadership posture than in a negative hanging back, dog in the manger posture. I think the UN will begin work on space debris with or without us by the middle of the decade. I think Europe is going to go forward with a remote sensing satellite to do monitoring of military deployment and to do treaty verification activities collectively for Western Europe. The vote was taken in the European Council in September of last year to fund the definition of what this system would look like. Another vote was taken in January of this year to fund preliminary system design. So it looks like the Europeans have decided that they're going to go ahead and put up a regional remote sensing treaty verification military monitoring type of satellite system, because when the French went to the United Nations in 1978 and said, wouldn't it be great if the UN did this? And if the UN could collect global data on military deployment and activities and make it available to governments of the world, that would be a very neutral third-party observer. And why should we all be dependent on the US and the USSR for this kind of data? Why don't we go and collect it for ourselves collectively? The United States shot that down, the Russians shot that down, we wouldn't collaborate, we said we wouldn't give them any of our data, and we didn't want that kind of an institution, so it fizzled. The French came back in 1982 and proposed it again at the disarmament conference in Geneva. Again, we spoke in opposition. 1988, it was tried again, we spoke in opposition. This year, they've decided, since the big powers, Russia, the United States, Japan, do not want to go along with this, the Europeans will do it independently. So there's going to be a European regional remote sensing satellite system for treaty verification and military monitoring and crisis management. Also, I think by the end of this decade, for reasons that I have difficulty rationalizing other than national prestige, I believe Europe and Japan are going to launch a man into space. What that will mean in the long term, what it will mean in the total complex of things, I don't know. I think they believe it will strengthen their negotiating position with the United States and with Russia. I think they believe it will strengthen their industrial capability. Having demonstrated that capability, they will have a stronger industrial base in place. And I think they believe that it's going to give them more world political prestige. So they're going to go forward with these programs, and they've already committed to fund them. So you can expect to see a European-launched astronaut in Earth orbit and a Japanese-launched astronaut in Earth orbit by the end of this decade. Finally, in the long term, I think we'll see the United Nations get eyes in the sky. I think that the European regional system eventually will establish enough resistance, enough opposition to the resistance that the resistance will fade, and we will see a United Nations Global Monitoring Agency come into being probably between 2000 and 2005. I also believe that we are eventually going to have a United Nations coordinating agency to do for astronautics and astronautical flight what the International Civil Aviation Organization does for aviation, what the International Maritime Organization does for maritime use of the oceans, what the International Telecommunication Union does for telecommunication services. As the number of nations multiply, the complexity of programs increases, and we have more manned missions on orbit, we're going to have to do a better job of coordinating. And I think a UN agency will emerge to do that. My voice won't give me 3 more minutes, excuse me. I'm projecting that because of their doggedness, their determination, the structure of their industrial government cooperation, their setting of long-term goals, and consistently sustaining march toward those goals, within the next 10 to 15 years, the Japanese are probably going to take the lead in the manufacture and sale of a lot of the things for astronautics that we have had a lead in and are beginning to share with Europe. I think we're going to see Japan as a major provider of hardware for outer space within the next 20 years and possibly within the next 15 years. I see all the groundwork being laid to achieve that, including an annual increase of between 12 and 15% of their space budget every year for the last 5 years. While we've been reducing or holding our space budget, they've been gradually going up 12 to 15% a year. And there's no indication that they're going to let up on that. Japan is now spending on space almost as much as all of Western Europe. The Japanese budget's about 2.8 billion this year compared with about a 3.1 billion budget for ESA. So the Japanese are moving up into the ESA range of activity and are probably going to pass ESA and eventually become a major supplier of hardware for the rest of the world. I mentioned earlier, I don't want to get into a lot of military uses of space, that's another whole topic, but I just want to point out that I think that just as costs are going to drive us to make some rational decisions about what we're doing in space in the civil sector, we're also going to be driven by costs to make some very rational decisions about what we're doing in the military sector. And I see the unilateral disarmament that is being economically dictated to our government that has begun continuing over a period of time. And as the Russians show greater and greater willingness to take down their offensive systems, we'll take ours down. And there probably aren't going to be that many more treaties on this subject. We're just both going to do it out of economic necessity. If you haven't seen the book, allow me to commend to you a book written by an arms control negotiator and an industrial leader in the aerospace defense industry. Kenneth Edelman, who is the former director of the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, collaborated with Norman Augustine, who is the chief executive officer of Martin Marietta. And they have written a book about our defense and our whole defense industrial complex and where that's going. And one of the points that they come to in that book, and it's very much more elegantly presented and defended than I could, is the point that we must go to unilateral disarmament for a variety of our strategic systems out of economic necessity. We simply can't afford to keep pushing the technology forward the way we have been. And in the absence of the Soviet threat, that's even a stronger argument. So I think costs are going to drive us toward greater disarmament in the strategic sector. I think there's a good chance that we might see a new move in the very near future to establish an international lunar station. Instead of the United States going back to the moon or the Russians going to the moon, we may wind up here within the next 3 to 5 years with an international treaty that says we're going to collectively go to the moon and set up an internationally manned space station there and learn what we can about the resources of the moon and what we can do on the moon that's useful. Finally, I think one of the major markets that's being overlooked by the U.S. industry is in Latin America, and I think that in the decade that will follow the year 2000, if the governments of Latin America can continue moving toward greater economic responsibility, as several of the larger countries have been doing in the last 10 years, and they intend to bring the benefits of space technology to their populations collectively, the continent of South America can be a major market for the United States overseas sales for engineering support, hardware, and launch services. If we go at it right, we could be using the Latin American continent as a very, very significant market to supplement and to compete in against, to supplement our own and to compete in against our foreign competitors. So in conclusion, I believe space will continue to drive states to more and closer collaboration and programs of mutual interest. I don't think we're going to see a continuation of unilateral activity. I think that where Early Bird was offering 120 voice grade circuits across the North Atlantic in 1965, and we have Intelsat 7 offering tens of thousands of circuits today, where we were excited to see cloud pictures in 1965 of 1 kilometer resolution. Today we're working with Earth imagery that has 1 meter or less resolution. We've seen an enormous growth in the technological capability, and what we need now is to create the political and the economic machinery that allows us to take that technology and put it to work for the world. There are a lot of people out there who are still going hungry, who can't find potable water, for whom medical services are not even made aware, that they aren't even aware that services could be made available to them because they have no communication capacity, they have no agricultural management capacity, they don't know where their freshwater supplies are. And I think that there's an enormous service that can be accomplished by bringing the benefits of space technology to the third world countries. I don't think we're doing adequately what we can do in that area. Progress in technology has been remarkable. We're still only slowly learning how to live together on this planet. And as the marvels of astronautics continue to unfold, we're driven to consider wisely how much we can gain from cooperation compared to going on and insisting that we go it alone and everyone else go it alone. There is a profound change taking place in the conduct of the affairs of states in astronautics today. I think these changes will accelerate. These changes demand and are based on a willingness to cooperate. And if we're not out there willing to cooperate on a reciprocal basis with many of the nations who are active in this area, rather than moving forward with them, they're going to move by us. Thank you very much.
We have a few minutes for some questions. Don?
Yes, sir.
What are your, in terms of your thesis, which I agree with, I think space is the place for synergy. What do you think of the ISY 92 World Space Congress? And relative to a coordinating agency, what's your thoughts on a global or world space agency or administration really coming in aid?
What do I think of the 1992 World Space Congress as part of the ISY, the International Space Year? And what do I think about the possibility of a World Space Coordinating Agency really coming into being? The first one, World Space Congress that will be held in Washington from August 25 to September 5, 1992, is a first in history. What has happened is the International Astronautical Federation, which is a worldwide federation of engineering and scientific organizations involved in astronautics, and the Committee on Space Research of the International Council of Scientific Unions, ICSU's COSPAR, have decided that instead of having independent conferences at which all the space scientists come together and tell about what they're learning by using spacecraft, and all of the engineers come together and talk about the kind of spacecraft and launch vehicles they're building and what a wonderful job they're doing, what we're seeing for the first time in history is the Committee on Space Research of ICSU is going to overlap with the International Astronautical Congress of the IAF, and we're going to have the scientists and the engineers all in Washington, D.C. at the convention center for a space of about 10 days. I think it's a very signal achievement to bring these two organizations together and to get the scientists and the engineers talking to one another in the same forum at the same time about what they hope to do, what they have accomplished, and what they believe they can accomplish. They've lived on separate tracks since COSPAR was created in 1960. IAF goes back to 1950. But now they're coming together, and I think that's a very, very significant step, and I think it's an exciting potential. It's going to be one of the biggest space congresses ever held, probably the biggest congress in the history of the world, and there will be a tremendous amount of attention given to that in the press when it comes about. Some of you may have had reason to know of Theodore von Karman and the work that he did at Caltech for many years and helping to found the Aerojet Corporation. Theodore von Karman has been selected by the Numismatic Advisory Committee of the Post Office, and they're issuing a stamp to honor the life of Theodore von Karman, and the issuance of the stamp is going to take place at the opening ceremony of the World Space Congress. So we've got the government of the United States here. The President of the United States has been invited to address the opening session. The Secretary General of the United Nations has been invited to address the opening session. If they're not there, they'll be represented by very high officials. I think it's an excellent opportunity for Bush to make a major national statement on his space policy on the eve of the election if he chooses to do that. So I think it's going to be a major program. a major activity, a signal event in the history of bringing the world community together. We'll have scientists and engineers from all over the world in one place for 10 days talking to each other. And I think that's always a good thing. Secondly, what do I think about a space agency being created in the UN? It's been proposed a number of times, including by formal papers to the General Assembly through the government of the Soviet Union in recent years. The United States is opposed to it because the United States would like to maintain freedom of action in space for as long as possible. And the United States sees the World Space Organization as likely to put rules and constraints on its freedom of action. So the United States is dragging its heels. Western Europe is not excited about having a World Space Agency at this time. Nobody likes the idea of piling on more bureaucracy. But I'm here to tell you, when we've got 8 or 10 or 12 nations launching, and a half a dozen of them putting men in space, we're going to need a coordinating agency. So I believe it's inevitable, not a question of whether, it's only a question of when. And I would begin work on it now because I think it's going to take 5 to 8 years from the time you decide you want it until you're able to define it and get it agreed. So I think we're overdue to start work on that if we want to have it in place by the year 2000. I hope there will be one soon. I doubt it because there's political resistance to it among major powers. Yes, sir.
I'd like to tie one of your early points with one of your latter ones that which you initially said one of the things we've been doing, it perhaps not in our best interest, has been inhibiting the flow of technology out of the country, trying to hang on to it, protect it, particularly for the sake of the Japanese. And in the latter part of your presentation, you suggest that Japan will become a major supplier and player in the provision of equipment, if not as an operator as well. How do you react to people who say, well, if we in fact did lower all the restrictions and really try to engage the Japanese in space kinds of technology, what's to keep us from having a repeat of what happened with VCRs, TVs, and to some extent automobiles? Would we not just be facilitating our own technological empowerment? But what is how do you react?
The point there is that if we were to go into collaborative activity with joint enterprises where we shared what was going out, there is enough critical technology that we can hang on to. There is enough. I can tell you an awful lot about aerospace technology, and I can give you a lot of technical documents. And I can say that if you put flange A into slot B and this, that, and the other, and run these tests, this is going to happen. But I can tell you that if you want to make a rocket engine, there's a hell of a lot of black art still in the process, not on paper. Not everything we know is going to be transferred or could be transferred. I think we can have a collaborative posture with someone we're working with and have an integral role in their programs through that collaboration without necessarily giving them everything we know. Point one. Point two is, whether we want them there or not, they're going to be there. And my point is, since they're going to be there, we ought to be thinking very seriously about how we mesh our interests and do things that are in mutual interest. The automobile industry came to consciousness well after they lost 25% of the domestic automobile market and said, holy cow, they're going to put us out of business if they don't stop this for us. This is what we're going to do. Joint ventures. So we started entering into these joint ventures. Then we found out that the Japanese are magnificently cunning in the management of these joint ventures. And somehow it turns out parts are all being built in Japan and the assembly is all taking place in the United States. It could easily take place in Mexico or Brazil or southern France. We are being locked out of technology evolution because of the way we're going into the agreements in desperation. I think we've got to go into the agreements with our eyes open. The desire to maintain a certain degree of technological control, not to give it all away for the sake of getting an agreement, and do that on a measured basis over time. I think we're going to continue to have our IR&D, our independent research and development programs. We're going to continue to have our university research centers. We're not going to stop working on new technology. But my argument is if we don't collaborate more with other producers of hardware, we could easily be locked out of the marketplace. The only response I can give you is it's a question of balance and measure. I don't say just open your coffers and give them everything you know.
We have time for one short one. We lost over.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Can you speculate on the implications to our international space policy for the various presidential candidates? In other words, depending on...
I haven't heard any of the major Democratic candidates make a statement as to what they feel or believe should be done with the National Space Program. I think Bush has a pretty strong pro-space position right now. I think Buchanan would be relatively strong on pro-space for the sake of national integrity and economic stability. But I don't think it's clear. I don't think your question can be given a clear answer at this point. As we get closer to the election and hear more discussions among the candidates on substantive issues, we may learn more. But they're so caught up in discussing one another's personalities and private lives now, we're not learning a hell of a lot about what any of them think.
I'd like to thank Steve Doyle for being here.